Hey everybody, welcome back. Thank you for joining me for the next chapter in our Americans at War series. Today we have arrived at what is perhaps the most defining global conflict of the 20th century, World War II. But in order to understand how this devastating war came to be, we have to look back just a few decades earlier at the uneasy peace that followed the so-called War to End All Wars. At the end of World War I, the world was left shattered. Millions dead, empires in ruins, entire populations displaced or grieving. In 1919, the victorious Allied powers gathered at Versailles to negotiate peace. But the treaty they came up with, the Treaty of Versailles, rather than offering reconciliation, imposed harsh penalties, particularly on Germany. Under the treaty's terms, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the entire war, surrender a significant amount of territory, and pay enormous reparations, payments which crippled Germany's economy. Additionally, the treaty dismantled Germany's military, limited its sovereignty, and humiliated its people on a global stage. These punitive terms created a perfect storm. In the years that followed, Germany's economy collapsed under the weight of inflation, unemployment, and national debt. A deep sense of injustice and resentment began to fester, one that was skillfully exploited by political extremists. Among them was a former soldier and failed artist named Adolf Hitler, whose nationalist rhetoric promised to restore Germany's pride, rebuild its strength, and undo the shame of Versailles. Meanwhile, the whole world was slipping into instability. The Great Depression in the 1930s spread economic despair far beyond Germany's borders. In Italy, fascist dictator Benito Mussolini had already seized power. In Japan, a militaristic government had begun to expand aggressively into Asia. And in Germany, Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, quickly consolidating control, eliminating political opponents, and beginning a terrifying campaign of anti-Semitism, censorship, and building up the military, which was directly in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Despite early warning signs, much of the world looked the other way. Western democracies like Britain and France, exhausted from the previous war and focused on their own domestic problems, followed a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid another conflict. But Hitler's ambitions only grew bolder. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. In 1939, it seized Czechoslovakia. And finally, on September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war. World War II had begun. In the early stages of the war, the United States remained officially neutral, just as it had in World War I. Still reeling from the Great Depression and wary of foreign entanglements, many Americans supported non-intervention. But the war quickly escalated in both scale and brutality. Germany swept through much of Western Europe, the Soviet Union and Japan made aggressive territorial gains, and then on December 7, 1941, the Japanese military launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 Americans and drawing the United States fully into the war. World War II was a war unlike any the world had ever seen before. It was fought on 6 continents, involved over 100 million people, and resulted in more than 70 million deaths. It brought with it unimaginable horrors: the Holocaust, atomic warfare, total war against civilian population, and ultimately reshaped the global order for generations to come. By December of 1941, Japan had conquered much of East Asia and was poised to expand across the Pacific Rim. General Hideki Tojo oversaw the culmination of Japan's effort to drive colonial powers from Eastern Asia and to establish a self-sufficient empire. In an ominous prelude to World War II, Japanese forces swept into eastern China in 1937 and laid waste to Shanghai and Nanking. Japan's leaders proclaimed that this was the first step in creating a new order that would rid Asia and the Pacific of Western colonial and imperial influence. Japan had annexed Korea in 1910 and taken control of Manchuria in 1931. Tojo became War Minister in 1940 and Prime Minister in 1941. He directed the occupation of resource-rich French Indochina, today Vietnam, then set his sights on British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the American Philippines, and Australia. By December of 1941, Germany had seized control of most of Europe and was at war with Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler was single-mindedly pursuing his goals of military conquest and the elimination of Jews. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party had swept to power in 1933. Immediately, he began a vengeful and compulsive quest to remake Germany and the entire world. He rebuilt Germany's war machine, mobilizing industry and expanding the military. He seized territories, the Rhineland in 1936, Austria and portions of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and Poland in 1939, which sparked the beginning of World War II. In 1940, he launched air attacks on Great Britain and took over France. He invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and even set his sights on the United States. Simultaneously, Hitler began the systemic mass murder of Jews and other groups he considered undesirable. By December of 1941, Italy had made imperial gains across the Mediterranean and joined in Germany's war effort. Benito Mussolini dreamed of building a modern Roman Empire by conquering the Mediterranean. Mussolini had become dictator of Italy in 1926 with dreams of restoring the glory days of the Roman Empire. Beyond a blustering propaganda campaign, his military gains were limited to seizing easy targets: Ethiopia in 1936 and Albania in 1939. In 1940, as the German Blitzkrieg spread across Europe, Mussolini allied himself with Hitler and opened a self-directed parallel war in the Mediterranean. He dispatched ill-prepared Italian forces to North Africa and Greece, hoping that an eventual German victory would enable Italy to claim these territories. As the Japanese expanded their empire, they subjected enemies and prisoners to extremely brutal treatment, enslavement, or execution, most notoriously in the capture of Nanking in 1937. Here we have a Japanese flag, a Japanese officer's sword, and a 6.5mm Japanese Type 38 rifle with bayonet. The Axis powers, which were Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, ruthlessly pursued territory and power. Underlying Axis ambitions were strong beliefs in racial and ethnic superiority that were used to justify wanton slaughter. When they joined forces to defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Allies resolved that the war could never end in a truce. It would require unconditional surrender and replacement of the entire enemy governments. This is a German field marshal's baton. As the Nazi Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, raced across Europe, German forces committed unnumbered atrocities against the men, women, and children in their path, especially the Slavs. Most notoriously, the Germans undertook the systemic brutalization and murder of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and anyone else they considered inferior. Here we have a swastika flag, a 6.5mm Italian M1891 carbine with integral bayonet, and a 9mm German MP40 Schmeisser machine pistol. At 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, air forces of the Japanese Navy attacked U.S. naval bases and airfields on Oahu Island, Hawaii. The quiet of a Sunday morning was shattered by the drone of low-flying planes, then thundering explosions and strafing gunfire, and then wailing sirens and anti-aircraft fire. Nearly 200 Japanese bombers, torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters swarmed over Oahu, battering ships and aircraft. An hour later, a second wave attacked. By 10 o'clock a.m., 18 ships were listing or sunken in the oil-slicked, burning waters of Pearl Harbor. More than 300 aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Nearly 2,500 Americans were dead and more than 1,000 were wounded. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into a world war already well underway in Europe and Asia. On December 8th, Congress rallied to President Roosevelt's call, voting to declare war on Japan. The president signed the declaration the same day. On December 11th, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy declared war on the United States. For Americans, the global war that had already been raging for 2 years was just beginning. President Roosevelt made last-minute revisions to his address to Congress requesting a declaration of war with Japan. Among the changes he penciled onto the typewritten draft was a new wording for what was to become one of the most memorable lines of the speech. Compare the typewritten original with the handwritten revision, a date which will live in infamy. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was just the beginning of a massive offensive that moved across the Pacific. While fires still roiled out of control at Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked more targets in the Pacific. Over the next 3 weeks, they swept across Eastern Asia nearly to Australia and invaded the Philippines. Crippled American naval and air forces were unable to intervene. But the attack on Pearl Harbor had missed the U.S. fleet's heavy cruisers and aircraft carriers, which were away at sea during the raid, as well as tank farms filled with vital fuel oil. And all but 2 ships at Pearl Harbor were eventually retrieved and restored to service. Here we have a Purple Heart citation and medal awarded to Edward C. Morse, who was killed in action aboard the USS Arizona on December 7, 1941, a piece of a Japanese plane shot down at Pearl Harbor, shrapnel from the attack on the USS Pennsylvania, pieces of Japanese bombs and a plane, sweetheart pins, and a radiogram announcing the air raid. Responding to Uncle Sam's call, American men, mostly in their early 20s, hung up their civvies and put on a uniform to go to war. The United States summoned millions of American men, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, from farms and cities, for training and service in the U.S. land, naval, and air forces. 6 million joined, 10 million were drafted. They found themselves at one of hundreds of mobilization camps and training centers across the country. They received a haircut, immunizations, a stack of uniforms and gear, a bunk, a footlocker, and a rude awakening. Most of them had just weeks to learn soldiering, then the technicalities of weapon systems or the complexities of support services, before they faced the realities of war. Here we have an enlistment poster, an order to report for induction from 1941, an absentee ballot request, a notice to appear for a physical exam from 1940, a draft card from 1942, and identification or dog tags. Recruits and inductees became cogs in a giant military machine. Individuals became serial numbers identified by the metal tags they had to wear around their necks. The company bugler marked the strict regimens of military life, calling out orders from reveille to taps. Many a recruit shared the same sentiment expressed in the popular song of the day, "For the hardest blow is to hear the bugler call, 'You've got to get up, you've got to get up, you've got to get up this morning.'" Arthur C. Moody was a private at the Army's Camp Blanding near Stark, Florida. He said, "I have washing, shaving, shoe greasing and polishing, and several other things to do on top of taking a rifle apart and cleaning it each night. During the day, it is marching. Mama, if you are worrying about me, you should quit, because if millions of other boys have taken this treatment, I guess I can." Master Gunnery Sergeant William Michael Woods, who trained in 1942 at the segregated Marine Corps facility at Montfort Point, North Carolina, wrote in 1999, "I was proud of the fact that I trained with an all-black unit. If you've been trained with whites, they would say you measure up because of them, and they're not going to be able to say that. So I'm proud of the fact that I was trained with my folk by my folk. For 17 weeks, trainees were billeted in open bay barracks that accommodated over 60 people on 2 levels. Trainees learned to snore, shower, sweat, swear, smoke, and soldier together. Strangers in adjoining bunks had just weeks to become brothers in arms. Shared experiences of drilling, calisthenics, field training, classroom study, even bunk inspections ideally built bonds of loyalty and trust. American forces numbered in the millions, but individuals operated in small groups organized around weapon, mechanical, or technical systems. Sometimes crews numbered a dozen or fewer. 1 million African Americans trained and served in segregated units, building strong bonds with their fellow soldiers, but few across racial lines. Ships crossing the North Atlantic with troops and supplies bound for war zones in Europe had to contend with German submarines. Tons of American-produced supplies and war material, as well as hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops, had only one way to get to Europe, in ships crossing the North Atlantic. German submarines, called U-boats, posed a constant threat to Allied vessels, even ships in U.S. coastal waters. By war's end, more than 2,500 would be sunk. But the deployment of ships in convoys, as well as ever-improving detection technologies and anti-sub weaponry, ensured that thousands of tankers, merchant ships, and troop transports were made safe, albeit nerve-wracking, across the Atlantic. Allied counterattacks ultimately destroyed most of the U-boat fleet. Cargo ships and transports sailed in groups, protected by armed escorts and, at times, air patrols, but they remained vulnerable. Because lone ships at sea were highly vulnerable to attacks by prowling German U-boats, the Allies began to dispatch supply and troop ships in groups. At first, several ships were accompanied by a single destroyer. Soon, dozens of vessels, sometimes more than 100, were sailing together with multiple warships. Airplanes acted as spotters, first flying in patrols above coastal waters and later launched from escort ships. Convoys transported everything needed to wage war, an iron mountain of weapons, ammunition, equipment, supplies, planes, and vehicles, and of course, tens of thousands of troops. Crew members in combat information centers tracked enemy vessels using visual sightings, radio direction finding, radar, and sonar. They also used intelligence from ultra-secret decoding of German intercepts. They communicated findings via radio telephones and teleprinters, or, when under a radio silence, signal lights. Here is a signalman flashing a coded message. Here we have a shipboard headset and chest-mounted transmitter, dungaree pants and shirt, a Dixie cup cap worn by U.S. Navy enlisted men, a flak helmet worn by telephone talkers at battle stations, a life jacket, and a signal light. This is a German submarine bridge jacket and German binoculars. At the height of the war, when U-boats were sinking more than 20 merchant ships a week, U.S. mariners continued to deliver the goods. Even when traveling in protected convoys, the U.S. merchant fleet of tankers, freighters, transports, tugs, barges, and newly built Liberty ships was vulnerable to attack by wolf packs of German U-boats. A torpedoed vessel hit amidship in the engine room could sink in less than a minute. Often it caught fire or exploded first. Ships transporting fuel oil or munitions were especially vulnerable. 1 in 26 U.S. mariners died during the war, a rate higher than that of any of the other services. Those who survived the sinking returned to sea again and again. When ships sank, most crew members died. Navy and Coast Guard escort vessels rescued the few survivors. Merchant ships were forbidden to stop. Pulled from the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, men were nearly always covered in thick oil from torpedo-ruptured engines and fuel tanks, and they were often wounded. Allied forces turned their sights first on Germany and its allies, and in 1942 attacked Axis-occupied North Africa. Armored divisions battled in wide-ranging encounters, often in suffocating heat under a scalding sun. A coordinated air, sea, and land campaign battered Axis forces in North Africa, and armored divisions, especially tanks, played a crucial role. German tanks were more heavily armed and armored than those of the Allies, and German General Erwin Rommel, whom the Allies called the Desert Fox, used them with skill and devastating effect during battle. Allied tank crews, or tankers, at first deployed their lighter tanks in surprise attacks against Axis armored divisions, but in the end they outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outlasted the Germans. In 1942, untested U.S. troops joined British forces already in North Africa, who had been battling Italian and German advances in North Africa for 2 years. Supported by hundreds of warships and support vessels, plus bombers and fighters, Allied troops put ashore along Africa's northern coast. Then they pushed east to join the fight against Axis strongholds in Tunisia. Allied air, naval, and ground forces initially outmatched and often stopped, but gradually isolated the Axis army. Months of brutal fighting ended the war's first Allied victory and taught green U.S. troops and commanders hard truths about real combat. Here we have a U.S. tanker's helmet, 60mm rockets for bazooka, early and late versions, a U.S. M1 bazooka, the standard anti-armor weapon, a British Mark I helmet from 1941, and a German Afrika Korps helmet. In 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were becoming personal allies. Here they are together at the 1941 Atlantic Conference off Newfoundland. They agreed to destroy Germany first, then Japan. With Germany battling Russia, U.S. war planners wanted to open a second front in German-occupied France, but Roosevelt deferred to Churchill. The Allies would first attack in the Mediterranean, the soft underbelly of Nazi-occupied Europe. At times, the alliance between American and British military commanders became fractious, marked by bitter rivalries. When Allied forces invaded southern Sicily in the summer of 1943, U.S. Lieutenant General George S. Patton was determined to best British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. In what Patton considered to be a horse race in which the prestige of the U.S. Army is at stake, he raced up the island's west side. Patton reached Messina, Sicily's northernmost port, before Montgomery, just after Axis troops had escaped. Subsequently, Americans began to assume more control over tactical planning, but were repeatedly overruled when they questioned the British strategy of continuing to fight for Italy. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that Italy promised the best approach to Nazi Europe, but Allied advances bogged down. In July of 1943, 500,000 Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen were deployed in a massive amphibious assault against German and Italian forces on Sicily, a rocky island just south of Italy's boot. British and American commanders, often at odds and fiercely competitive, struggled to coordinate operations. They quickly won the island, but most of the enemy escaped. Lightly resisted landings in Italy in September belied the bloody struggle that lay ahead. It took 9 months for Allied forces to claw their way to Rome, and they never reached Germany. By the end of the war, Allied casualties in Italy topped 300,000. An infantryman in Italy wrote in 1943, "They grow to be more than mere buddies. They become blood relations to you, and then they die before your eyes. Not a pleasant, natural death, but an unimaginable kind of mutilation, mixed with groans and prayers, ending with a gurgling last breath." These are combat boots from 1943, a .45 caliber U.S. M3 submachine gun known to GIs as the Grease Gun, and a U.S. M1910 canteen. From 1941 to 1945, the Willis Overland Motors assembly line in Toledo, Ohio, turned out nearly 360,000 Jeeps. The Ford Motor Company manufactured nearly 150,000 of a similar model. The quarter-ton, four-wheel drive vehicle proved a versatile and reliable workhorse. It was easy to fix and maintain, and its headlights could even be pointed towards the engine for nighttime repairs. In this image are Japanese-American soldiers of the 442nd Infantry Regiment. Ernie Pyle, a war correspondent around 1944, wrote, "I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for and keeps on going. It doesn't even ride so badly after you get used to it." In the summer of 1943, the U.S. Army Air Corps expanded daylight bombing runs against industrial targets in Germany and occupied Europe. Bombers flew hundreds of miles, far beyond the range of available fighter escorts, to attack oil fields, refineries, and factories. Hundreds of planes and thousands of airmen were lost. In 1944, longer-range escorts made bombing more effective and less costly. After intense debate, the Allies agreed to launch an assault across the English Channel into German-occupied France. On June 6, 1944, a massive Allied force landed on the beaches at Normandy, France. American war planners had long wanted to make a direct assault on northwest Europe, but the British had refused. Roosevelt deferred to Churchill, and neither heeded appeals from Joseph Stalin, who was battling expansion eastward into Russia, to open a second front in the west. But in the spring of 1943, the British relented. That fall, Stalin enthusiastically endorsed the plan and pledged to join the war effort against Japan. By spring of 1944, a year of Allied bombing had weakened Germany's war machine, and the stage was set for D-Day. On D-Day, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers hit the heavily defended beaches of northwest France and battled their way inland. On the choppy waters of the English Channel, nearly 7,000 Allied navy and merchant vessels pushed towards the beaches of Normandy. Overhead, 12,000 bombers and fighter planes poured inland. Soldiers loaded with gear were crowded into open landing craft, tired, cold, stiff, soaked in sea spray, many of them seasick. Wave after wave of troops waded ashore, some in neck-deep water. They were met by withering fire from concrete pillboxes atop high bluffs. Left and right, soldiers exploded in blood. Survivors clawed their way forward, securing an Allied foothold in France. The exact number of American, British, and Canadian soldiers, sailors, airmen, and mariners who were killed on June 6, 1944 is unknown, but anywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 died that day. Many were buried in farmers' fields just beyond the beaches, their bodies wrapped in mattress covers, their graves marked with a helmet atop an upended rifle. Here we have a U.S. M1 helmet and a .30 caliber U.S. M1 rifle with bayonet, a U.S. Army Air Force's service cap, and a pneumatic life belt. Following the landings at Normandy, Allied forces fought to liberate France and prepared to enter Germany. After D-Day, the Allies poured 2 million troops and tons of supplies, equipment, and munitions into France. Allied troops and armored divisions under the overall command of U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower spread inland from the beach and airdrop zones in Normandy. In bitter fighting, they battled their way through fields and along country lanes into villages and from door to door, while Allied bombing and strafing battered German defenses. In August, amphibious landings from the Mediterranean poured troops and supplies diverted from Italy into southern France. Meanwhile, Allied forces crossed the Seine River and entered Paris. By mid-September, the Allies were in control of Belgium and stood ready to strike Germany. Allied ground troops doggedly pushed their way across France, fighting among hedgerows one day and along city streets the next. Infantry fired and moved, advancing in concert with tank divisions, artillery, and air support against strong German resistance. They stormed enemy positions, traded fire across fields, and tramped along winding roads that were often littered with shattered wagons, abandoned bicycles, burned-out trucks and tanks, and bloated bodies. In towns, many of the bombed-out buildings and streets were filled with rubble. They advanced from door to door in close-quarter fighting, always wary of sniper fire. During the 3-month advance, 37,000 Allied troops were killed. As GIs spread out across France, they were never without their semi-automatic M1 rifles or their helmets nicknamed steel pots. In addition to 80 pounds of gear, they carried rounds of ammunition and hand grenades for close-quarters fighting. Troops were also supplied with mortars and shells, shoulder-fired bazookas, and machine guns. Infantry units were often widely dispersed, receiving their orders and coordinating artillery and airstrikes via portable radio sets. In these displays are a canteen, a belt with a knife and first aid pouch, a .30 caliber U.S. M1 Garand rifle that has a spring steel clip with 8 rounds of ammunition. This was the first semi-automatic rifle used as a standard shoulder arm by the rank and file of any army. Also here is a .45 caliber M1911A1 semi-automatic pistol, a U.S. M1 helmet, and a longer-range EE-8A field telephone. There is a U.S. M4 knife bayonet for use with an U.S. M1 carbine, a .30 caliber M1919A4 machine gun used as both a company-level flexible light machine gun on the M2 tripod mount and as a fixed machine gun on armored vehicles, a .30 caliber U.S. M1 carbine developed as a lightweight shoulder arm to replace service handguns for non-combat troops, and an ammunition belt. Private First Class Leslie Cruz of the 82nd Airborne Division wrote in 2001, "Rushing past a 20-foot-high hedgerow, I landed with a thud. As I peered skyward, the planes kept droning above in the flak-ridden sky. Occasionally, one large flash appeared and I would see a plane silhouetting earthward. Oh my God, I thought, there goes a whole plane load of guys." Sergeant Frank Mabonte, a gunner with the 8th Air Force, was a prisoner of war for 14 months after being shot down. He wrote in his memoirs in 2002, "As we approached our target at Frankfurt, one of our engines started faltering. Then, as we dropped our bomb load, we lost another one. The order to bail out came via the intercom. I saw our B-17 for the last time as it made a banked turn to the right and disappeared in some low clouds." General Dwight D. Eisenhower said on August 29, 1944, "The enemy is being defeated in the east, in the south, and in the north. He has experienced internal dissension and is nearing collapse. We in the West must seize this opportunity by acting swiftly and relentlessly and by accepting risks in our determination to close with the Germans wherever we meet." U.S. troops paraded through Paris and kept on marching. They raced to join other Allied forces sweeping towards Belgium and Luxembourg, bound for Germany. The Allied armies had the Germans on the run. The wake of their hasty retreat was littered with abandoned equipment that became trophies of war. These are French civilians showing the route towards Berlin. Sidewalks and streets filled with cheering crowds as Parisians celebrated the end of the 4-year Nazi occupation. On August 29, 1944, U.S. infantrymen marched down the streets of Paris. They were greeted with cheers and kisses as residents celebrated the city's liberation from German occupation. France had fallen to the Nazis in 1940, but an internal resistance movement had struggled to sabotage occupying forces and overthrow the German-backed Vichy government. By late summer of 1944, as Allied troops neared the city, freedom fighters took to the streets and Allied commanders dispatched a French armored division to the city. In days, the commander of German forces in Paris surrendered. This is a Nazi flag, a 9mm German P-38 pistol, and a German U-boat officer's dagger with scabbard and portopee. This dagger was taken at the surrender of German forces at the U-boat base at Lorient, France on May 10, 1945. It was given to U.S. Army S. Sergeant Arthur Hoffman, who served as a translator at the surrender ceremony. On December 16, 1944, Allied troops crossing Germany's western border were surprised by a last-ditch German counterattack. Allied troops were massed along miles of the German border when the Nazis mounted a surprise offensive in the forests of Belgium. The Allied line bulged, but it did not break. A month of bitter fighting in winter cold and deep snow cost the Allies nearly 80,000 casualties. Some 20,000 Americans were killed. The battle further depleted Germany's disappearing resources and fighting forces. Its army by now was deploying boys, many younger than 16 years of age. But the Germans' desperate resolve hardened, setting the stage for a bloody battle for Berlin and their homeland. Here we have a wool overcoat and hood, mittens with trigger fingers, and a knife bayonet, relics from the Battle of the Bulge. The Soviets spent most of the war battling a German invasion. In 1944, they turned the tables, and in 1945, surged into Germany. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and rapidly advanced inland, establishing a front that stretched from Leningrad to Moscow to Stalingrad. The Germans quickly found themselves mired in a brutal fight they could not win but would not give up. Losses on both sides were astronomical. By 1944, the Russians were on the offensive. They drove German forces out of Soviet territory, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans, then moved into Germany, where they unleashed a reign of revenge-fueled terror. By April of 1945, more than 1 million Soviet troops stood poised to capture Berlin. American and British forces poured in from the west across the Rhine River. In early spring of 1945, Allied infantry and armored divisions, in concert with a massive, relentless bombing campaign, pushed towards Berlin from both the west and the east. Millions of Allied troops advanced across Germany, breaking through German defenses and taking thousands of prisoners of war. Along the way, they freed Allied prisoners of war from prison camps and discovered unimaginable horrors at Nazi death camps. In the first week of May, following Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30th, the Nazi regime collapsed. Berlin fell to the Soviets, and Axis armies in Italy gave up. Germany finally surrendered effective May 8th. The war for Europe was over. During the war, nearly 94,000 Americans, about 200,000 Britons, and 5,700,000 Soviets were taken prisoners of war by Nazi Germany. While English and American captives were sometimes mistreated, Slavs, considered racially inferior by the Germans, were routinely brutalized, starved, left to die of disease, or executed. We are looking at Stalag Luft III, a German prisoner of war camp for officers and pilots. The U.S. Military Intelligence Service X was created in 1942 to help Allied prisoners escape. It concealed radio components, maps, compasses, and money in toiletries and recreational items that it sent to prisoners in care packages. Here is a British naval button concealing a compass, a shaving brush, pipe, and baseball, each with a hidden compartment, and prisoner of war ID tags. Allied forces discovered concentration and death camps where Nazis had killed 6 million Jews and 5 million other undesirables, including gypsies, disabled persons, and homosexuals. Inside the camps, troops found piles of gaunt, dead bodies and some emaciated survivors. This is General Eisenhower at the Ohrdruf concentration camp. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, American forces in the Pacific initially assumed a defensive posture. In early 1942, the Japanese expanded their empire with dramatic victories throughout Asia and the Pacific. Following their success at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese conquered Pacific territories from the Gilberts in the south, Burma in the west, and the Aleutian Islands in the north. They captured Hong Kong, the Dutch Indies, and the Philippines, and threatened Australia and New Zealand. Because the Allies had agreed to give highest priority to defeating Germany and Italy, resources for combating Japan were limited. Still, the Allies began fighting back. The U.S. Navy halted the advance of Imperial Japanese Navy in the Coral Sea in May and decisively won the Battle of Midway in June. In June 1942, the U.S. Navy dealt the Japanese a devastating blow, sinking 4 aircraft carriers and killing many aviators. Believing that the U.S. fleet was still vulnerable, the Japanese attacked the Midway Islands as a step towards taking Hawaii. But U.S. forces, having broken Japanese codes, were waiting for them. When the two fleets clashed, the Japanese seemed to be winning, easily destroying 2 waves of U.S. attack planes. Then a few U.S. dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers with planes refueling and sank 3 of them. Another was damaged and later sank. Although the United States also lost a carrier, it was easily replaced by U.S. industry. The Japanese never fully recovered. In 1942, Japan had cut off land routes to Chinese forces fighting with the Allies. In response, the Allies began flying in supplies from India over the Himalayas in the first sustained round-the-clock aerial resupply in history. By 1945, more than 600 aircraft were involved, and the operation brought in 650,000 tons of supplies. This flying jacket was worn by George Gay, the sole survivor of his squadron at the Battle of Midway, June 4 through 7, 1954. Also here is a U.S. B-4 life preserver nicknamed a Mae West after the actress. Success in the Pacific War required cooperation between Army and Navy forces. Although General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz did not always agree, they effectively collaborated on a 2-pronged attack to victory. Here is MacArthur and Nimitz in 1944. In 1942, Japan cut off land routes to Chinese forces fighting with the Allies. In response, the Allies began flying in supplies from India over the Himalayas in the first sustained round-the-clock aerial resupply in history. By 1945, more than 600 aircraft were involved, and the operation brought in 650,000 tons of supplies. Lester I. Tenney, one of 70,000 prisoners forced to go on the horrific Bataan Death March, where more than 7,000 men died or were killed, wrote in his memoirs in 1995, "We saw an American soldier kneeling in front of a Japanese officer. The officer had up his samurai sword. Up went the blade, then with great artistry and a loud banzai, the officer brought the blade down. The sound of a dull thud, and the American was decapitated." On April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led 16 B-25 bombers, launched from an aircraft carrier more than 700 miles out to sea, on a daring raid on Tokyo. Most of his planes hit targets in the capital. Although the raid caused modest damage, it embarrassed the Japanese government and greatly boosted U.S. morale. In 1943, the Army and Navy jointly began a two-pronged attack through the Central Pacific and across New Guinea to the Philippines. In the Central Pacific, vast ocean areas separated critical island bases. Fast carrier task forces and Army bombers attacked the targeted islands while slower amphibious forces made bloody assaults on island strongholds. Once captured, the islands became airfields and supply hubs for the next attack. In the south, Allied forces continued west around Rabaul, bound for the Philippines, supported by the Army Air Forces and, at times, the Central Pacific Fleet. Gradually, the Americans pushed the Japanese back and opened the way to assault their homeland. To secure the Pacific Islands, Marine and Navy forces made amphibious landings and assaulted Japanese strongholds. Island assaults began with massive bombardments from ships and aircraft against shore positions. Forces landed in specially designed landing craft, many of which could move up on the beach itself before unloading. Once on the beach, the men fought their way inland, attacking enemy troops hidden in caves, bunkers, and fortified heights, often suffering heavy losses. Their weapons included not only mortars, rifles, and machine guns, but also fearsome flamethrowers. The Japanese were tenacious fighters who resisted fiercely, even when they had little chance of winning. From 1943 on, American submarines were highly effective, eventually destroying 55% of Japanese ships and strangling the country's major supply lines. Soldiers on board the USS Griffin, a submarine tender, kept score of the ships sunk by the submarines in their squadron. This is a lost board on the submarine tender USS Griffin. Private First Class Raymond Knight wrote in his memoirs in 1985, "We went over the wall into heavier fire as the Japs had pillboxes staggered to protect one another. 16-inch shells off of our battleships would ricochet off of them, but they were finally knocked out by flamethrowers and charges dropped down the vents. These Marines are on the beach at Tarawa, Gilbert Islands in November 1943. Indian code talkers used their complex and largely unknown language in an innovative program to protect communications. Some 400 Navajos were trained to convey information about troop movements and tactics. They took part in every Pacific assault from 1942 to 1945, and their code was never broken." Having penetrated Japan's Pacific Island Empire, the United States began devastating air attacks on Japan's home territory. Even as the United States was completing its capture of the islands east of Japan, it began bombing the Japanese homeland. In October of 1944, General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines. He had been forced to evacuate in March of 1942, and began pushing back the Japanese. The Japanese islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa fell in March and June of 1945. Meanwhile, the Army Air Forces started a strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities that met little resistance and had devastating effects. The government of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo fell in July of 1944 after the loss of Saipan to the Allies. Still, Japanese militarists retained power and resisted surrender, bringing continued destruction on their own people. An invasion of Japan appeared inevitable. The United States tailored its bombing campaign in Japan to cause maximum devastation and break the Japanese will to fight. In March 1945, U.S. bombers changed tactics. Instead of flying high-altitude daylight runs against industrial targets, they began low-flying nighttime attacks on cities with incendiary bombs. Firestorms devastated property and killed civilians as well as soldiers and factory workers. On the night of March 9th through 10th, for example, U.S. bombers destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo and killed close to 100,000 men, women, and children. By mid-June, most of Japan's major cities were destroyed. Aerial mines were dropping in harbors while the U.S. Navy launched carrier attacks against coastal targets, but even still, the Japanese fought on. Guillermo Rumian, a Philippine guerrilla, said in 2004, "We were herded together by the Japanese. They were trying to ferret out guerrillas. They pulled out the man in front of me and the man on the left side and hung them with their feet off the ground. Then we were all stripped naked and made to jump in place for about 4 hours, but nobody squealed." Late in the war, desperate to inflict greater losses on U.S. forces, Japan began sending pilots on suicide missions, using their airplanes as guided weapons against U.S. ships. Japanese pilots flew some 2,800 kamikaze missions, sinking 34 Allied ships and damaging 288 others. On August 6, 1945, a U.S. B-29 dropped an atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, Japan. Warfare and the world were forever changed. President Harry Truman personally ordered atomic bombs dropped on Japan, and within days, Japan surrendered. In July of 1945, President Truman had made his controversial decision to use atomic weapons that had been developed secretly during the war by the Manhattan Project scientists. Allied submarines had crippled the Japanese merchant fleet. Firebombs had destroyed dozens of Japanese cities. Few targets remained. Yet Japan had still not surrendered. Americans incurred enormous losses taking Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese suicide attacks on U.S. ships had killed more sailors in 2 months than in the previous 2 years. More than 1 million troops were moving in to invade Japan when the first bomb destroyed Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb leveled Nagasaki, and Japan finally surrendered. These images are from Hiroshima. 6 years of war came to an end in 1945 with the crushing defeat and unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The Allies celebrated the collapse of Germany and victory in Europe on VE Day, May 8, 1945. Across Britain, Europe, and the United States, jubilant crowds took to the streets, their elation and relief tempered by the knowledge that war still raged in the Pacific. But the celebrating was unrestrained on August 15, 1945, when Japan admitted defeat. "This is the day we have been waiting for since Pearl Harbor," said President Harry Truman. "This is the day when fascism finally dies." Surrender documents were signed on September 2nd in a ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The United Nations organization, chartered by 50 nations in June of 1945, promised international peace and security. Peace was won, but an uncertain future lay ahead. Although the American economy was booming and the nation's spirits were high, 8 years of war had left cities worldwide in ruin, economies in shambles, and civilian populations displaced and ripe for unrest. The United States championed the establishment of the United Nations, daring to hope that it would keep world peace and safeguard U.S. economic and political interests worldwide. Even as tensions with the Soviet Union surfaced, American forces were rapidly demobilized and millions of GIs returned home. Nearly 60 million people, combatants and non-combatants, died worldwide during World War II. The first battles in what would become World War II took place when Japan invaded eastern China in 1937 and when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. It would be 8 dreadful years before the fighting stopped. Victory in Europe and in the Pacific brought euphoric celebrations and tremendous relief worldwide, but the toll that had been taken in human suffering and lives lost was staggering, and for many regions of the globe, devastating. President Harry S. Truman addressed the nation on August 9, 1945. "We have used the bomb against those who attacked us without warning at Pearl Harbor, against those who have starved and beaten and executed American prisoners of war. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans." Dr. Kazuo Hanaoka, head of internal medicine at Hiroshima Communications Hospital, said in 1945, "I saw nothing that wasn't burned to a crisp. I saw fire reservoirs filled to the brim with dead people who looked as though they had been boiled alive. In one reservoir, I saw a man horribly burned, crouching beside another man who was dead. He was drinking blood-stained water out of the reservoir. Japanese Emperor Hirohito, in a radio address on August 15, 1945, announced that the Japanese were accepting the Allies' surrender terms. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable, and taking the toll of many innocent lives. This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers. Second Lieutenant Paul Fussell, aged 21 when en route to Japan in August 1945, wrote in his memoirs in 1988, "When the bombs dropped and news began to circulate that the invasion of Japan would not, after all, take place, that we would not be obliged to run up the beaches near Tokyo, assault firing while being mortared and shelled, we cried with relief and joy. We were going to grow up to adulthood after all." This is Lieutenant Thomas Quinn in his TBM-3 Avenger at Marpy Point, Saipan in 1944. In 2004, he wrote in his memoirs, "I was launched to participate in a massive flyover of Tokyo Bay and USS Missouri during the signing ceremony of the Japanese surrender. Thank heaven there were no mid-air collisions in that gaggle of aircraft. It would have ruined my whole day to have been killed when I'm just getting ready to go home." This next section is about the Nisei soldiers of World War II. Japanese-American soldiers fought against both the Axis powers and American prejudice during World War II. In 1942, shortly after the United States entered the war, the federal government forced Japanese Americans out of their homes and into internment camps. Even as many of their families were confined, thousands of Nisei Japanese Americans, people born in the United States to immigrant parents, volunteered for military service. They served with distinction in Europe and in the Pacific, garnering a host of military decorations. Their successes in combat forced Americans to confront the injustice of the Japanese-American internment. The image on the wall above is the color guard of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team near Bruyères, France, November 1944. Thousands of Japanese Americans were forced out of their homes and confined in desolate camps for up to 3 years. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered nearly 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, into internment camps. Surrounded by barbed wire fences and under the constant gaze of armed guards, they strove to maintain some semblance of a normal life, but they were never able to escape the realization that fear and racial prejudice had caused the U.S. government to strip them of their constitutional rights. Japanese Americans were out fighting for their country even while many of them had families who were held in internment camps. Most of the more than 30,000 Japanese Americans who served during the war were members of the 100th Infantry Battalion from Hawaii and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, segregated units that fought together in Europe. In some of the most grueling battles of the war, they became among the U.S. Army's most highly decorated units, receiving thousands of individual decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor. More than 6,000 other Japanese Americans served in the Pacific as translators for the Military Intelligence Service. This is Harry S. Truman at the presentation of a Presidential Unit citation to the combined 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in July 1946. He said, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you have won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win." Nearly 70 years after the end of World War II, the U.S. Congress presented the nation's highest civilian honor to Japanese American soldiers who served with the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service. "Go for broke," the phrase that appears on the front of the medal, was the motto of the 442nd. It captures the risk everything ethos of the Japanese American soldiers who served during the war. Foreign nationals and U.S. citizens of enemy ancestry were removed from their homes and held in detention camps. Fearful of threats to Homeland Security, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. His order authorized the removal of, quote, any or all persons from areas of the country deemed vulnerable to attack or sabotage. Nearly 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, two-thirds of which were U.S. citizens, were forced out of their businesses and their homes. They were held in internment camps in isolated locations for up to 4 years. Japanese and Japanese Americans in California sometimes had only several days' notice before they were relocated. Thousands were forced to sell their homes and businesses quickly at an enormous loss. Many Japanese Americans were wrongfully imprisoned in hastily built, woefully inadequate camps. Surrounded by barbed wire fences and under the constant gaze of armed guards, they endured the discomforts, regimens, and indignities of confinement and of having been stripped of the most basic rights of citizenship. This is a kobu, or knotwood figure, carved wooden pins, wooden vases, and a fan made in an art class at the Rower Relocation Camp in Arkansas, and a painting in the field. Also here is a knotwood cane used in camp by an Issei, a first-generation Japanese immigrant, a duffel bag with the assigned family member number used to tag luggage and each family member. Evacuees were allowed only 1 sea bag and 2 suitcases per person. There's also a metal suitcase here carried by an evacuee who was transported to an assembly center at the converted Tanforan racetrack and stables in San Bruno, California, then on to the Topaz Camp in Utah. This next section is about different types of industries that assisted the war effort without being directly involved in combat. For each infantryman in combat, 10 other men or women in uniform provided support or supply services. Not every soldier in America's vast war machine carried a weapon or shipped overseas. Most of those in uniform, including all 400,000 women in the armed forces, were support troops. Many were responsible for training, deploying, and sustaining fighting forces. Many more procured, transported, and maintained the material and technologies needed to wage war. And thousands of civilians also provided support for U.S. troops. First of all were mechanics. The most vital weapon employed during the war was often a wrench wielded by the soldiers who served as mechanics. An ambidextrous corps of worker fighters, these men and women did whatever was necessary to maintain and repair vehicles, ships, and weapon systems. Without them, noted the National Geographic in 1942, not a wheel could turn, not a tank could run, nor a plane could fly. Here is a set of herringbone twill coveralls, a mechanic's tool bag, a gas can from a Jeep, a maintenance form on a clipboard, and a framed photo of Craftsman recruiting poster. Frank Douster, in his oral history in 1995, said, "I didn't want to be a file clerk, so I was transferred to another unit where they made me a weapons mechanic. I don't know which was stupider, me for turning down that file clerk job or the Army for trying to make a mechanic out of me." Next up is nurses. About 65,000 nurses served in the Army and Navy, and most of them were women. Hundreds worked just behind the front lines, contending with the perils of combat as well as its bloody results. Thousands more worked farther along the chain of evacuation on hospital trains and ships, aboard medical transport planes, and in station hospitals abroad and stateside. One nurse recalled hours of giving injections, anesthetizing, ripping off clothes, stitching gaping wounds, of amputations, sterilizing instruments, setting the treated patients into their beds, covering the wounded we could not save. Here is a box of gauze, a first aid dressing, a U.S. Army Nurse Corps cap, a syringe and stethoscope, a U.S. Navy Nurse Corps uniform jacket, a U.S. Navy Nurse Corps cap, and a recruiting poster from 1944. Nearly 9,000 Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish Army chaplains served during the war. Hundreds more served in the Navy. Although unarmed, many accompanied troops into combat. They were required to give regular character guidance and venereal disease lectures. But in religious services and personal conferences, they offered spiritual and moral support for scared, battle-weary soldiers. Chaplains rescued the wounded and attended the dying. They conducted services for the dead, assisted with registration of graves, and wrote letters of condolence to bereaved families. Here is an abridged prayer book for Jews in the Armed Forces of the United States, a song and service book for ship and field, a Roman Catholic rosary given by a chaplain to a soldier in Europe, a brass chalice and host container from a chaplain's kit, and a New Testament issued to service personnel. Here we have a Red Cross poster from 1943, a blood drive poster, a prisoner of war food package, a Red Cross uniform dress and hat, and volunteers packing food kits for POWs. Red Cross volunteers and staff offered a friendly hand to America's fighting men and women abroad. The Camp Service Branch provided counseling, family information, even financial assistance. Service clubs, often in makeshift quarters, offered recreation and meals, barbershops, and laundries. Clubmobiles brought coffee and donuts to troops in the field. Red Cross social workers and nurses served in military hospitals. Blood banks collected and distributed 13.4 million pints of blood during the war. Other workers coordinated relief programs for Allied POWs and civilian war refugees. Alma Geist Kapp, a Red Cross worker, wrote in her oral history in 1997, "One of the big things we did each week was bingo, which the fellows loved. The cooks, who would bend over backwards and do anything for us, would bake pies and cakes for prizes. Neither Mary nor I smoked, but we had our cigarette ration, so that was also a prize." U.S. military services operated a transportation network within the United States, across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and within war zones. Trains, ships, and aircrafts, many times flown by women Air Force service pilots called WASP, provided essential connections. Trucks and their often weary, bone-rattled drivers were the last links in the logistical chain. Nearly 6,000 trucks, mostly with African American drivers, supported the Allied advance towards Paris in the summer and autumn of 1944. In an operation dubbed the Red Ball Express, they transported almost 500,000 tons of supplies in 3 months. Here is a Yank magazine, a Red Ball Express patch, a Fifanella, which is a winged gremlin created by Walt Disney and adopted as the WASP mascot, a WASP flight jacket, and a framed Army Service Forces poster. Here is a jacket worn by a flight training instructor, a postcard of Link Trainer, a ground aviation trainer, a Link Trainer logbook, and training manuals. Thousands of military personnel worked stateside as instructors. Many were the barking drill instructors central to basic training. Many others were chalk-toting lecturers who conducted classroom sessions or hands-on workshops. The U.S. military developed training programs and ready reference field and technical manuals for hundreds of topics, from the operation of weapon systems to weather forecasting. William Lubar was an air training instructor. He wrote in his oral history in 2004, "We had the pilots, co-pilots, and navigators as students. You would put your student in the link trainer and close the hatch. This was strictly blind flying. We would give him an assignment, possibly a landing. He would have to look at his instruments, see what was happening, and fly into whatever airport." Thousands of soldiers were assigned to secretarial and clerical support positions stateside and in combat theaters. They answered phones, operated switchboards, took dictation, typed correspondence and reports, and filed carbon copies in the burgeoning military bureaucracy. After 1942, most were women who had been recruited to free a man to fight. They served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC, later joined the Women's Army Corps, WAC, the Navy Waves, and Coast Guard SPARS, and the Marine Corps. Here is an Army handbook from 1943 issued to newly enlisted WAACs. A typewriter, a telephone operator headset, a WAC uniform jacket worn in England by telephone operator Staff Sergeant Margaret Frank, a WAAC cap, and a framed WAAC recruiting poster.
I just want you guys to see what you're fighting for, that's all. How many parts to view? I wish that I could kiss each and every one of you. Want to get a cramp with that for you? Are you blowing your roof or something? How about Mr. Jerry Corda? Why don't you get back in the section? There's no one. You're not open you. Stop saying the nerves, go back, please. It's a nice smooth gray. Pour a little in your glass and drink it right down. But be sure to ask for Guzzler's gin. A nice smooth gray.
Why, is there something wrong, Irving?
Yes. No, you've got the name wrong. It's Irving Jones.
Irving Jones?
Yes, I changed it. Anything over here named Berlin, they cut up into sectors.
going to murder the Bueller. Someday you're going to find him dead.
And then I'll get that other pup, the guy who makes the bugler up.
And then the rest of my life in bed.
May we not forget the debt that we owe to you day and night.
Traveling shows brought entertainers and a bit of home to troops in war zones. The United States Organization, USO, sponsored many of the shows that brought welcome relief to homesick and battle-weary soldiers, sailors, and airmen. The big events featured stars like Bob Hope, the Andrews Sisters, or Marlene Dietrich, but even visits by struggling singers and three-ball jugglers caused troops to erupt in cheers, laughter, and applause. The USO also operated more than 3,000 centers stateside and overseas. Every day, they offered troops a host of social services as well as opportunities for rest and recreation, a simple cup of coffee, or a swinging dance. This Is the Army was Irving Berlin's morale-boosting, money-raising musical extravaganza with an all-soldiers and sailors cast. It opened on Broadway on July 4, 1942, and toured the country, as well as played to troops in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. American GIs wrote and received millions of letters, so many, in fact, that the War Department started V-mail, which was correspondence that was microfilmed, transported, and then printed for distribution. Here we have a poster promoting V-mail from 1943 and some V-mail itself. Also here are greeting cards, records used by soldiers to send messages home, Lucky Strike cigarettes, a lighter, and Hershey's chocolate. Morale-boosting pinups adorned the billets of American GIs worldwide. They were even kept in the liners of their helmets. Many variants of the sultry Varga Girl by Alberto Vargas, often clipped from Esquire magazines, were favorites, as were photographs of Hollywood stars like Rita Hayworth and Betty Grable. Here are the Varga Girls and Betty Grable in 1943. Fireman 2nd Class Lee Mahoney said in 1944, "You won't find one barracks overseas that hasn't got an Esquire pinup girl. I, for one, have close to 15 of them. Those pictures are very much on the clean and healthy side, and it gives us guys a good idea of what we're fighting for." This is a soldier with one of the favorite pinups of Dorothy Lamour. Major social changes in the decade after World War II included suburbanization and an emerging civil rights movement. Two post-war occurrences altered life in the United States. First, millions of Americans moved to the suburbs for the good life of prefabricated houses with picture windows, appliance-filled kitchens, television sets, and station wagons. Second, African Americans, many of them veterans, returned to their struggle against segregation with renewed vigor and won new support from the government. President Harry Truman ordered the armed forces to desegregate, and federal courts moved to integrate public schools. World War II veterans were ready to make the most of their hard-won peace and the nation's prosperity. The GI Bill made it possible for all returning veterans to achieve the American dream of owning a home of their own. Educational subsidies and job-finding aid helped many veterans increase their earning and spending power, and more than 4 million no-down-payment, low-interest mortgages helped them finance the purchase of a new house, which cost around $8,000. The GI Bill fueled an unprecedented growth of America's middle class and contributed to the phenomenal spread of suburbs nationwide. Returning veterans were welcomed home with parades, celebrations, and warm embraces. But for many, readjusting to civilian life was challenging. Some returned wounded or with permanent disabilities. Others were plagued by troubling memories of combat and the death and destruction they had witnessed in battle. This is a veteran and his family moving into temporary housing at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. The GI Bill subsidized veterans' living expenses while they pursued their education and offered low-interest mortgages to those wanting to buy homes. But veterans returned home to an acute housing shortage. Many found themselves bunking in surplus military Quonset huts until the housing industry could catch up. 1/3 or more of 16 million U.S. veterans took advantage of the GI Bill's educational benefit. In 1949, veterans were 49% of all college enrollments, and they swelled the attendance at vocational schools. The bill gave African American veterans unprecedented educational opportunities also. Births in the United States jumped from 2.8 million in 1945 to 3.4 million in 1946 and 3.8 million in 1947. The number continued at high levels through the mid-1960s. The generation born during this baby boom shaped American life and culture for decades to come. Here is President Franklin D. Roosevelt signing the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill, on June 22, 1944. Also here are publications explaining the benefits to veterans. Okay guys, that is the end of the World War II exhibit as part of the larger Americans at War exhibit at the Smithsonian. There is another section dedicated to the United States home front during the war, which I also filmed, but I think I'll release that as another video on another day since this video is so long already. As World War II came to a close in 1945, the world was left forever changed. The conflict had spanned every ocean and 6 continents, claimed tens of millions of lives, and unleashed technologies that had never been seen before, from radar to jet engines to the devastating power of the atomic bomb. For Americans, victory was both a moment of triumph and a moment of reckoning. The war had demanded enormous sacrifices of soldiers on the battlefield, of civilians at home, and of families torn apart by loss. But it also ushered in a new chapter in American life, one marked by rapid change, growing power, and complicated responsibilities. When American veterans returned home, they entered a country vastly different from the one they had left behind. The United States was now considered a global superpower, with its economy booming, its infrastructure intact, and its industries stronger than ever. Millions of returning servicemen found new opportunities through the GI Bill to advance their education and job training and become homeowners. Suburbs expanded, highways were built, and the middle class grew. Women also saw many changes during the war. With so many men overseas, millions of women had stepped into factories, offices, and other jobs previously closed to them. After the war, many of these women were pressured to return to domestic life, even as they carried the skills and confidence they had gained in the workforce. The tension between these shifting gender roles and traditional expectations would also shape the post-war landscape. Internationally, the world order had been redrawn. Nazi Germany was defeated, Fascist Italy had fallen, and Imperial Japan had surrendered following the atomic bombings of its major cities. Europe lay in ruins, and for the first time in modern history, only two nations stood out alone at the top: the United States and the Soviet Union. Though they had been allies against Hitler, their alliance was uneasy and temporary. In the aftermath of the war, ideological lines hardened and new global rivalry began to take shape. Thus dawned the Cold War, a conflict not fought directly on battlefields, but through diplomacy, espionage, economic pressure, and proxy wars around the globe. The fear of communism spread quickly throughout the West, and the United States took on a new role, defender of democracy and capitalist values against the perceived threat of Soviet expansion. The ideological showdown would not stay cold for long. By 1950, the tension had exploded into open warfare on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded South Korea, drawing the United States and United Nations into a bloody, grueling, and ultimately inconclusive conflict. Though often overshadowed by World War II and Vietnam, the Korean War was the first true battlefield of the Cold War, and it tested America's willingness to fight communism abroad in a new kind of war, where victory was murky and sacrifice was high. So as we wrap up our look at World War II in the Americans at War exhibit, it's important to recognize that while the Axis powers were defeated, peace was still not truly secured. Instead, a new kind of struggle had begun, and it would shape American policies, foreign policies, and society for decades to come. In tomorrow's video, we will dive into the Cold War and examine how the world's superpowers began their long standoff, and how that conflict first turned hot on the Korean Peninsula. If you are still here watching, thank you so much for being here. This is the postcard that I have for today, Rosie the Riveter, which I think is fitting even though we will talk about the effects of World War II on the home front in a different video. If you would like to receive this postcard, please leave a comment to let me know, and I'll respond with an email address where you can send me your mailing address. I would love to write you a note of appreciation and send it out to you. Thank you so much to everyone for watching. I'll see you guys another day in another video.